Thank you all for joining us. I think more will join as we get started. This is a webinar we are doing jointly with the Bridge Tank, an international think tank based out of Paris. I'm very happy to have Joel, the president and the founder of the Bridge Tank, with us today.
Very happy to be here and very honored to co-host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much. And today I'm also happy to have Mallory to conduct the webinar. It's a refreshing break for me. I've been doing it all this while and I'm at MRC. I think people are also tired of hearing me. So thank you, Mallory, for extending that support to us as well. To start with, I will request Nishtha to come in, and then Nishtha, please hand over to Mallory to conduct the thing. Nishtha, all yours.
Sure, sir. A very good evening to the esteemed panel and everyone else who has joined us for this webinar on a very timely and relevant topic, which is AUKUS. Before we start in, I'd just like to So now, before we proceed towards the main part of today's webinar, I would like to inform you about the sudden demise of Mrs. Rashmi Arnavdas. Mrs. Rashmi was the director at Maritime Research Center and Needhwani Technology. She truly proved herself as a pillar of support to both the institutions. Her contribution as part of the leadership at MRC and NDT will always be a source of inspiration for all of us. Kindly join us in observing a minute of silence and pray for her departed soul. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Mallory to take over the stage and hope you all have an insightful evening ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nishtha. So good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Mallory Lebaille, and I will be conducting this webinar today. I'm an analyst and a program coordinator at the Bridge Tank, which is an international non-for-profit independent think tank specializing in emerging economies, global industries, sustainable development, and global public goods affiliated to the G7 and G20. The Bridge Tank is co-organizing this webinar with the Maritime Research Center, which we wanted to warmly thank again for the invitation, the trust, the organization, and the collaboration. So thank you, Dr. Das, and your colleagues also. We previously collaborated together with the MRC on a project on the blue economy of Bay of Bengal with the mandate of the French Development Agency, and we are glad to keep the conversation going with the MRC on maritime issues. I am myself a geopolitical analyst, and it's such an honor to conduct this webinar with experts in this field. Also, I'm aware about the geopolitical evolution and context, in particular in the Indo-Pacific. So today's objective is to discuss about the topic Australia, United Kingdom, United States, AUKUS, a new perspective based on the Underwater Domain Awareness UDA framework. The importance of this seminar is to discuss the strategic, military, and even political evolution of AUKUS 9 to 10 months after the creation of this alliance, and also how the UDA framework can contribute. This event is planned to entail the participants' point of view and share their experience about the policy issues, technological means, innovative tools and measures, geopolitics, geoeconomics, organization aspects, both nationally and globally. For this, we have around this virtual table high-ranking guests, whom we also wanted to thank for participating in this discussion, and we also wanted to thank the overwhelming audience today. And so as I'm conducting this webinar today, I will give you just a few technical details about this webinar. So first of all, we have had some changes in the agenda due to professional obligation from the ambassador De Gale and Mr. Weissner. So we apologize for the last minute changes. Also, dear panelists, during your intervention, please don't forget to open your microphone before you start your intervention. And once you finish it, please turn it off. And also, please respect the time limit of 20 minutes to ensure the good execution of the seminar. We will have a time for Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so if you have any question, feel free to prepare it for the end. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good seminar. So now let's welcome our first esteemed guest, who is Ambassador Sinha. Is Mr. Sinha here? Yes.
He's there, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Mr. Ambassador Sinha will give an overview of the geopolitical context in the new global order. He's an Indian diplomat who belongs to the Indian Foreign Services. He is a former High Commissioner to UK and Sri Lanka. After retiring from Foreign Services, he was first appointed as Central Information Commissioner and is now the Chief Information Commissioner of India. So Ambassador Sinha, you have the floor.
So you're muted, so kindly.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Good evening, everyone. It's good evening from India, Delhi, on a rainy evening. But thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me to start this very interesting webinar on AUKUS perspective underwater domain awareness framework. Since I've been asked to speak very generally, because obviously I'm not, like most of the experts on this panel, a specialist on the topic per se, but having served about over 37 years in the diplomatic service and in being High Commissioner in Sri Lanka and the UK, I have a reasonable idea of how the political framework has evolved in the recent decades and in the recent years. So if I may just touch very briefly on an overview and then concentrate on India's approach to some of the issues that are being discussed today, particularly the Indo-Pacific, which is something very much common to the discussion, the theme that will sort of run through this discussion, whether we discuss AUKUS or whether we discuss the Quad or whether we just discuss keeping the sea lines of communication open. So I think it's extremely important then to start off with a general overview. So as you're aware, at the end of the Cold War, there was a moment, not a moment, but a period when we sort of lived under a unipolar world with the United States as perhaps the sole superpower, and in the international context and international relations, the United States obviously played a very important, decisive role in international affairs. However, there have been since then other poles that have emerged. If you recall briefly, there was this idea that was flirted with G2, the US and China, but that obviously didn't make much headway for various reasons. I'm not going to go into detail. But what I did want to say was that a multipolar world is something that at least India and a large number of countries are striving for, where there are different poles, but where we all can work in concert to achieve a common goal. And I think that's very important, especially in the current context where there is conflict in Europe and there are tensions across the globe. The war in Ukraine has resulted in its own, it had an impact not just in Europe, but all over the globe in terms of supply chains, in terms of food security, and so on. So I think what is important is that now we are focusing on a region which is the Indo-Pacific, which is where India is strategically situated. And as we see the center of gravity travel east, we realize how important the Indo-Pacific is. The Indian Ocean, the old Asia Pacific, the Pacific Ocean. I mean, the definitions of the Indo-Pacific vary, but I think the importance cannot be overemphasized. And I find that while the term Indo-Pacific is not new, I understand it was first used in the 1920s by a German scholar, Karl Hosshofer, if I got the pronunciation right. But the importance of the Indo-Pacific has been underlined in recent years. And I think the emergence of China in particular has been a catalyst, as far as I could put it that way, in terms of keeping the focus in around the Indo-Pacific, because China, by its own right, has emerged as a major economic and military power. And I think it is important that every country, and I'm sure every country is impacted, especially the countries in the region, by this rise. And I'm not going to focus on that. My focus is more in terms of trying to ensure that the international community and the Committee of Nations do not in any way get adversely impacted by any developments in the region. And that is why perhaps in the context of relations within the region among countries, bilateral relations, and in India's case, India's bilateral relations with China and other countries in the region, I think India has been paying greater focus to the maritime domain, to the maritime space that surrounds India. And India, in that way, is strategically located in the Indian Ocean. And given its increasing outreach and both naval and maritime in general, I think it is quite important that it plays a role not as a note taker, but as a rule shaper. And I think that's extremely important. And that is why India has engaged with a multitude of countries and organizations in trying to ensure that this region, the Indo-Pacific region, remains peaceful and is conducive to the conduct of international trade and commerce, which is so important, economic linkages that are being formed. And I think it is important for a country like India, which is very much a developing country and trying to provide for its large population and at the same time ensure equitable growth for everyone, that India is able to engage with all the countries, both within the region and without, to ensure what I could, if I could call, a common prosperity. Now, I thought I would talk more about the Indo-Pacific, but I thought since we are focusing, and I'm going to focus on India, I think with this broad overview, if I may, focus on what I feel is important for India. So I did mention the major sea lanes of trade and communication. Now, India straddles key maritime choke points. This whole region does, and India is strategically placed. We have the increased threats of piracy, drug and human trafficking, IUU fishing, rising extremism, and other maritime security challenges. And I think it is important that we cooperate to tap the full potential of the blue economy, but also at the same time, we combat the threat of environmental degradation and climate change, which has become so important in recent times. And as part of our effort to engage various countries, I think India is an important member of what is called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, as it's commonly known. If you recall, in 2007, Prime Minister Abe floated this idea. It didn't go very far initially for various reasons. One of the partner countries was not particularly enthusiastic, but then in 2017 and after that, again, given the challenges that were confronting the region, the four countries, the US, Australia, India, and Japan, came together at various levels. I mean, it was at the official level, at the ministerial level, and at the summit level. The last couple of years have seen summits of leaders, both virtually and physical, to advance this idea of a common goal, a common goal towards achieving prosperity and ensuring security in the region, because we cannot really achieve prosperity without security. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that Quad is a net provider of security in the region, or it is a security alliance or organization. It is not. In fact, on the contrary, the Quad has diversified its activities depending on the challenges it's facing, particularly in the era of the pandemic, the way the Quad countries have come together to try and help the broader region. India itself, being a major vaccine producer, has reached out, but I will talk about that later. I think the Prime Minister of India has encapsulated that very well in terms of his security and growth for all, which is called Sagar, in a very historic speech, if I could put it that way, in Mauritius in 2015, which basically spells out what India hopes to achieve, what India wants to do in the region. I have already touched upon some of these elements, but I think given the fact that the sea lines of communication are facing threats, both traditional and non-traditional, including piracy, which I referred to earlier, I think India is slowly but surely emerging as a net provider of security, if not in the entire region, certainly in its neighborhood. And if you recall, this is something that has evolved over time, whether India's assistance to Maldives in the 80s and later in the region, we have seen how India has reached out, not just in terms of providing security in defense, but also in defense matters, but also in more more wider arena and fields like HADR or disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, or reaching out in times of crisis, for instance, what's happening in Sri Lanka. India has committed over $6 billion in terms of aid, in terms of very soft loans, grants. I think almost $650 million are pure grants into Sri Lanka. And particularly in this time of need, when literally I find it living from ship to mouth, at least as far as its fuel requirements are concerned, I think India is reaching out as best as we can. And I must add that we are the nearest sort of neighbor and perhaps the dearest neighbor too, but we're also the first responder. We did that during the tsunami or after the tsunami in 2004, and we're doing it in a much bigger way as we speak today. So I think it is extremely important to keep in mind that India's ability to provide assistance to help in the neighborhood, in the extended neighborhood, has increased over the years because of its capacities, the capacity building programs that it has undertaken, and of course, the economic growth that the country has witnessed in the last decade or so. And I think what is important is that India is prepared to share the fruits of its development with its neighbors, and in all its neighbors, in fact, almost all its neighbors. Speaking about Sri Lanka, I talked about the assistance rendered, but whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Nepal, whether it's the Maldives, we have sort of extended the hand of friendship. We've extended as much as we can do in terms of assisting those countries, both during the times of natural calamities, but also during normal times, during times when we are helping in the growth of that country, either through direct financial assistance or projects assistance or assistance in capacity building and training, which also extends, by the way, into the military domain. I mean, I recall that Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan Navy, for instance, the Coast Guard, the Army, and to a lesser extent the Air Force, send large number of their personnel to India for training at various ranks and at various levels. And this naturally helps in better operability in times of crisis, or even in times of providing assistance to third countries. We started this initiative of the maritime domain awareness with Sri Lanka and Maldives, extended it to Seychelles and Mauritius. And now, of course, we have the Colombo Security Conclave, where India, Maldives, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka have joined together for maritime security cooperation. And the countries, the member countries, are represented by their national security advisors. Of course, the 5 pillars, if I may just recount, are maritime safety and security, countering terrorism and radicalization, combating trafficking and organized crime, protection of critical infrastructure and technology, and of course, HADR, human assistance and disaster relief. I think what we need to focus here is how countries in the region can work together. And while I am not going to sort of elaborate on AUKUS, because I'm sure after go into greater detail, but as far as India is concerned, I think I could end with, if I may, a quote from our Prime Minister Modi, when he spoke at the UN Security Council high-level open debate for enhancing maritime security, a case for international cooperation. This was on the 9th of August, 2021. And I just want to quote a paragraph of what he said and the 5 principles that he enunciated before I conclude my intervention. I quote, "The ocean is our joint heritage. Our sea routes are the lifeline of international trade. And the biggest thing is that these oceans are very important for the future of our planet. But today, our shared maritime heritage is facing many challenges. Sea routes are being misused for piracy and terrorism. There are maritime disputes between many countries. And climate change and natural disasters are also maritime domain-related issues in this broad context. We must make a framework of mutual understanding and cooperation for the preservation and use of our common maritime heritage. And the 5 principles that he enunciated is that we must remove, the first principle, we must remove barriers from legitimate maritime trade. The second principle, the settlement of maritime disputes must be peaceful and on the basis of international law only. And this is very important in the context of the topic that we are discussing today. The third principle, we must face natural disasters and maritime threats caused by non-state actors together. Fourth principle, we have to preserve the maritime environment and maritime resources. And the fifth principle, we must encourage responsible maritime connectivity. I think this is very important. It spells out very succinctly where India is coming from and what India wants to what India strives to achieve through cooperation with all the countries in the region. But I will leave it to the experts to speak about the underwater marine domain awareness and, of course, the implications of AUKUS. But thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinha. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation, which provides a nice overview to start this webinar. If I would say, you perfectly highlighted that the security aspect is preeminent in the region, and it is important to consider it in order to avoid any ripple effect in every sectors, not only in the maritime domain. And you also mentioned that India is ready to provide any support to the neighborhood. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise. And you perfectly hand over the hand to Dr. Arnab Das to give an overview of the UDA framework in this new order. So Dr. Commodore Arnab Das, you are an ex-naval officer with 2 decades of active services and a PhD holder from Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, with specialization in underwater acoustics. You has also worked on several projects and you have a plethora of publication on to your credit. And you're also the author of a book titled Marine Eco Concern and its impact on the Indian maritime strategy. So I'll give you the floor for your presentation. Thank you, Dr. Das.
Thank you, Mallory. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Y.K. Sinha, sir, for your excellent opening remarks. And it really sets the context very well. I mean, as Mallory also brought out, apart from giving the geopolitical perspective, you also brought out the role India is willing to play, and I think India has to play a leadership role in the region. And I would also kind of take forward what you spoke about in a more structured manner in terms of discussing the underwater domain awareness framework that we have been working on. I would also once again thank Bridge Tank and Joel Ruet for partnering us for this webinar. Now, going forward, I would be discussing the larger geopolitical and geostrategic context of the AUKUS and particularly the underwater domain awareness. And we'll take a couple of case studies and then talk about the actual UDA framework that we worked on and few way aheads that we would like to submit to this very august audience. Now, in the 21st century, the new global order, it is very clear that the larger maritime interaction, unlike the previous century, is going to be in the tropical waters. Now, the tropical waters bring a very, very unique characteristics, both in terms of political or generating awareness in the tropical waters has its own challenges. Now, even when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategic space, that by definition itself, the Indo-Pacific strategic space is defined in the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So that is a very important distinction one needs to understand. And the conventional wisdom of importing technology and know-how from the West, I think has not worked in this part of the world. Now, when we talk about the Indian Ocean, and Ambassador Y.K. Sinha sir definitely brought this out very clearly, one is the unique position of India, and that's why India has to play a major role in the Indian Ocean. But it is also the other nations in the region which make it more interesting. And I think this partnership of Bridge Tank and Maritime Research Center becomes even more critical because the French also have a huge stake in the Indian Ocean. Probably they hold the maximum area in this part of the in this part of the ocean. So that's again very, very significant. Now let us talk about the AUKUS. This is basically a nuclear submarine deal between the three countries. There is a transfer of technology that has been agreed to. So the hardware and the actual technology is one aspect, but if this has to be deployed in the tropical waters, the underwater domain awareness would become the key driver for the AUKUS going forward. Now, whenever, I mean, in our last webinar that we had some time back, we also discussed the timelines when the AUKUS platform will be ready and those kind of things. So I think it is time that the global community focuses on the underwater domain awareness so that whenever such high value assets are ready, they can be deployed in a more effective manner. So there is going to be a significant shift in the entire global thought process in terms of the UDA. Now, just to give you a sense of the tropical waters, as we, I mean, to give you a little more details, I mean, the sonars that have been developed during the Cold War period that were developed for the temperate region, I mean, largely the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And the same technology is now being pushed to this part of the world. It is very important for us to appreciate that the sonar performance degrade to about 60 to 70% when it is deployed in these waters. So the Indo-Pacific region will have to be looked at very differently when we talk about underwater domain awareness. Now, from the Cold War era, the SOSUS, the sound surveillance system that was developed, and that was, I think, one of the initial and the most pioneering effort in terms of generating underwater domain awareness. Now, in the last decade, we saw the underwater Great Wall project by the Chinese. I'll talk about this in a little more detail in some time. So there is a significant shift in the technology requirement for the SOSUS and the technology requirement for the underwater Great Wall project that happened in the South China Sea and East China Sea. Now, this recent incident of USS Connecticut meeting with an accident is also a reiteration why the UDA is extremely important and why the tropical waters, in spite of the might of the US naval forces, they still had to go through this huge embarrassment in the tropical waters. So it only highlights how different and what kind of challenges we face when we talk about submarine deployment in the tropical waters. Now, in terms of the global efforts, it was during the Cold War period, as we are aware, the SOSUS happened, the various other technology developments happened in the Greenland Iceland belt. But the one decade in the last century where, we probably, as Ambassador Y.K. Sinha sir also said, that we had a truly unipolar world. And I think the American strategic community was under the belief that there is nobody who can challenge them. But towards the end of the last century, they realized that the Chinese have developed significant capabilities to deploy submarines. And that's when they initiated AsiaX in the South China Sea and East China Sea, because they needed data and they needed more understanding. And immediately following AsiaX, the US Navy started deploying US underwater drones to continuously update the information that they developed. But the Chinese also were not far behind. I mean, they participated in AsiaX in a manner that they could learn a lot from the US. And that was a major acoustic capacity and capability building effort by the Chinese. And that continued. I'll talk about it a little later. The MS-370 was another very interesting kind of an event, and post the loss of the aircraft or the accident, it was even more interesting when we talk about the UDA. When the search started, they realized, and particularly the area they chose, one very important thing is that there were almost 90% of the passengers who were Chinese who went down with the aircraft. But the Chinese were not given the responsibility for the search, although they were very keen about it. The West wanted to keep control, and Australia was given that control. But the most interesting part is when they wanted to do the search, they realized that they have no maps or charts of the underwater domain or of the underwater region. And it took them 1 year to develop the charts of the right resolution so that underwater drones could be deployed for the search. So it's a very interesting kind of a thing with respect to the MS-370. And in the tropical waters, we need significant amount of field experimental R&D. Just importing technology from somewhere else is not going to help us. Now, just to tell you about the AsiaX, the AsiaX was a university-led project. I mean, 6 US universities in the phase 1 did the entire modeling and simulation of the tropical waters of the South China Sea. And in the second phase, when they had to do the validation, they realized that there'll be a significant amount of diplomatic backlash. So they involved 20 universities, including these 6, to do the field validation. And this continued, AsiaX continued for almost 3 to 4 years. I mean, from 2000 to almost 2004. And this was a massive shallow water acoustic measurement exercise in the South China Sea, and this significant data was collected as part of this initiative. University of Singapore, many universities in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they all participated in this event. The takeaway for the US is very clear. They wanted data. They wanted to understand. They wanted to validate the models that they had built for the tropical waters in the South China Sea. But I was in Shanghai in 2016 and I met several of those people who were involved. The Chinese were very clear that they wanted to understand. And they did not, they acknowledged that they didn't have the capability to do such a thing on their own. So they wanted to participate and learn. And if you see the timing of it, it's very interesting that after Asia X, the Chinese continued to work. And it was in 2015 that the Great Wall, underwater Great Wall was announced by the Chinese. And looking at the face of it, it is very clear that it requires at least 25 years of preparation to build something like the Great Wall project. So very interesting to see how the Chinese have developed these capabilities and kind of, so I think I need to just stop the presentation and do it again because, yeah. So now another very interesting part was the US Navy started deploying drones after the Asia X. Now, after the underwater Great Wall project, you also will remember during the time when President Trump was just elected, and it was a 20-day period when he was a president-elect, the Chinese captured a drone by the US Navy, USS Bowditch. And this is a very significant geopolitical event just for the Chinese to send a message down that because the Americans have been continuously deploying acoustic arrays and acoustic drones after the Asia X so that they can consolidate their thing. Their underwater capabilities and underwater domain awareness. So this is very interesting how, so you remember this USNS Bowditch, and this drone was captured for 3 days and returned after, a bit of, whatever noise that got generated after this. So it is very important, how the Chinese have learned from the US or certain models that they have done and how they have built up and and now it is also known that in the last 3-4 years, the Chinese have been significantly deploying their resources in the Indian Ocean to develop the maps, or they've been also deploying research ships. And it is a report says that in 2018, the Chinese deployed 24 research cruises or research expeditions in the Indian Ocean, whereas the other 6 countries, including India, France, US, Germany, and the next top 6 other than China did only 26 together. So that is how aggressively the Chinese are building their capabilities in this water. So I think the AUKUS or the drivers of AUKUS also you need to take note of the underwater domain awareness requirement and the challenges that exist if we have to really take this forward, and we have to develop models. Now, one very interesting thing I would like to mention to this audience is in 1988, when India deployed the first nuclear submarine, it was INS Chakra, which was brought from Russia. The submarine sat down in position and the complete sonar screen was blanked out. Now, I want to take you back when the US had to deploy the first nuclear submarine, USS Nautilus. It was supposed to be deployed in 1952, but 1946, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography did a snapping shrimp mapping of the entire world. Snapping shrimp is a very interesting creature. It's very small. I mean, you can see that line which is drawn there is 1.5 centimeter. Snapping shrimps generate sound of the order of 200 dB reference 1 micropascal. Whereas the biggest mammal on earth, blue whale, generates 196 dB. Whales are in few numbers, single digits. The snapping shrimps are in millions. One snapping shrimp bed would have more than few million snapping shrimps. And you can imagine, and the frequency band is from 3 kilohertz to 15 kilohertz. So it can actually swamp a submarine deployed in the region. So the US Navy, or the strategists there, did a snapping shrimp mapping of the entire world. So these are various dimensions of the underwater domain awareness that we are talking about. If we have to deploy our high value assets, we need to create this. And I think in that respect, the Indian Ocean region requires a lot to be done. And I think India needs to play a very, very major role in all this. So I have talked about the snapping shrimps, how important they are. And for strategic submarine deployment, I think this is a very, very important. I mean, we started doing some study on this and we realized there are 14 subspecies of snapping shrimps. And each of them have their own vocalization pattern. So there's a lot of work to be done. We've already built a tool around this. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that there is a lot to be done when we talk about now the conventional maritime domain awareness that we are all aware. I would call it an event driven. After the 9/11, the US strategic community took it up very seriously, and MDA became part of, I think, almost all the discussions. Even back home in India also, after the 26/11, it became a very important thing. Everybody was talking about MDA. But somehow the security driven thing had a limitation because it did not encourage enough participation by the other stakeholders. So it is important that we acknowledge this, and it has remained on surface. So MDA without the underwater component, I think, will be very, very limited. Now, the stakeholders for the UDA that we have proposed is well known. The security, the blue economy, environmental regulators and disaster management, and science and technology. Just to give you a sense, I mean, one can see the proliferation of submarines in the Indian Ocean and around, or the Indo-Pacific, has been significant. Even smaller countries like Burma or Myanmar or Bangladesh have also started operating submarines. Thailand and these countries are operating submarines. And people in the Navy, we are in the know that it's not easy to deploy submarines. We've had a series of accidents also. The Indonesian Navy has suffered a whole lot of accidents. Even the Argentinian submarine loss was also a very, very grim reminder. And I mean, the USS Connecticut is also a reminder, the complexity. So but my worry is also about safety, nuclear safety in the region. So we need to definitely take this up very seriously and look at underwater domain awareness in a very, very different light. We had this incident 26/11. At that time, people came by surface boat, but do we expect the next attack also to happen with surface boat? So I think underwater domain awareness also has an internal security dimension, and we need to take it up very seriously. Migration, I mean, the boat migration is also a very significant phenomena. The Rohingyas are known to this, and I think boat people is more than 400 to 600-year-old phenomena, and there's a lot more studied that has been done, and more needs to be done. So from an underwater domain awareness perspective also, this is an important area, because these kind of migrations are really going to happen now with climate change and various other phenomena. I think this is going to be very serious. Blue economy, I think we are increasingly looking at the Indian Ocean region for energy security because of the location. On one end, we have the economic engines, on the other end, the energy suppliers. So this becomes a hotspot for ensuring energy security. Even we are increasingly looking at the sea for food security. But to give you a sense of the situation, the global fish stock is on the decline. And we need to really look at things very differently. But in the Indian Ocean, the bycatch is of the order of 80%. So how do we so there's a lot of regulation that is required. Deep sea mining is an important area, and whole lot of sustainability concerns for blue economy are issues which need to be looked at. Environment and disaster management. Now, with so much maritime activity, acoustic habitat degradation is another important area. I'll not go into the details of it, but there's a lot of focus required. And even disaster management, I think it's a very important area. Now, science and technology, how do we get science and technology into it? I mean, now so much of artificial intelligence and data analytics has come in, but how do we go into the digital ocean construct is something we need to really look at and focus on. I mean, and it can't be just security driven. It has to have other stakeholders participating in it. This is the framework that we have built. If you look at the horizontal construct, all the four stakeholders represent the four sides of the cube. But the problem, I mean, all of them may have the unique requirement, but acoustic capacity building becomes the core, because unless the sonar, we focus on the sonar performance, all the stakeholders will suffer and they will not be able to optimize their deployment. So I think there is a focus required, pooling of resources and synergizing of effort by all the stakeholders, and field validation is very important. Site-specific R&D is very important. If you look at the vertical construct, we have very little understanding of our own waters. Sensing is required, a lot of analytics, and then we have to get policy framework. And also, you will see among the different stakeholders, there is a lot of overlaps, and there is a lot of turf war and a whole lot of things. So this actually framework can give you a sense how to drive policy. Different aspects can be covered, and also prioritizing can be done using this. I'll not go into the details, but this actually covers every aspect. Even we talk about the demographic advantage in this part of the world. How, I mean, the BIMSTEC countries itself constitute 25% of the global population. So how can we deploy the young generation into meaningful global problem solving is something which can be easily answered by this kind of a framework. Just to elaborate on this, underwater radiated noise is something we could be looking at. Again, the same thing, different stakeholders can come together, pull in their resources, and then it is required for the Navy for acoustic stealth, it is required for acoustic habitat degradation from an environmental perspective, and of course, ship designers and shipbuilders. Various projects we have done. I think I will not go into the details, but just to elaborate on what are the dimensions of the underwater domain awareness. The unique, you can see different seasons of the year have a very different underwater behavior. So we have to map all these things. Unless we do that in the tropical waters, we'll not be able to achieve what we want to achieve. You can see different parameters changing with different seasons. And we have built these three-dimensional models. This is what we have converted the automated identification system and build a underwater noise map, spatiotemporal map. Snapping shrimp mapping, as I said, we have built the entire soundscape and the habitat maps. Submarine deployment tool taking into account the tropical characteristics. Skilling and knowledge is very important. Acoustic surveys required across all the stakeholders. Second is underwater biotechnology, biosciences. We have developed various modules, and also underwater AI and robotics is something very important. One has to, I think this would cover the entire requirement of skilling and knowledge in the underwater domain. It covers. So we've been doing a lot of programs. Every year we do a summer school where we train a lot of people. Now we want to do it for the entire region. You can see all kinds of senior people who have come and spent time with the participants. We've had more than 40 to 50 participants from all across India. Now, as the pandemic recedes, we would like to do it in the region, Indian Ocean. You can see former naval chief, also the chief minister of Goa, head of National Institute of Oceanography. And we also have been focusing on field work. So a field experiment, this is one of my PhD students working on the Khadakwasla Lake with proper deployment of various instruments and data collection for a 1 week period, and even field validating. So at the end, I would recommend an outreach, engage, and sustain formulation, where outreach is to sensitize, engage is to establish MOUs between organizations and developing a structured interaction, and sustain is to develop projects where we can really kind of make an impact, and setting up a center of excellence, which will have 5 centers, a research center for multidisciplinary research to understand the local site-specific characteristics, incubation center to encourage startups, skilling center, academic center, and also policy center. So we have developed various specific, like a lot of programs with the government of India. We can just align it to the digital ocean framework backed by the UDA that we have been proposing. Thank you. I think I've taken a little longer time because we have one speaker not there. So Mallory, thank you for your patience.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for your clear presentation. Thank you again. If I would say, let's summarize your deep presentation about the UDA, and I think I'm knowing more and more every time I'm hearing for you about this topic. You highlighted the fact that the UDA is particularly meaningful given the AUKUS alliance as a strong submarine dimension, and also that the UDA is not something new. And I wanted to say that given the geopolitical evolution and crisis, the UDA reminds us its importance. The underwater domain or even the maritime domain awareness are rarely debated in international discussion. And as I'm an analyst, I'm looking in every aspect in the international dimension, and I can say that there is a rare discussion on this aspect. So this is why we are gathered today to contribute to the UDA. And so thank you very much, Dr. Das and the Maritime Research Center to work on this topic. So now let's welcome our next panelist, who is Vice Admiral Cave. So Vice Admiral Cave is retired Indian Navy Vice Admiral. He PVSM and AVSM were awarded to Vice Admiral, respectively in 2018 and 2013, if I'm right. He last served as the 27th Flag Officer Commanding in Chief Southern Naval Command, and is retired 4 years ago now, and was succeeded by Vice Admiral Anukumar Sharla. So I would like to hand over the floor to Vice Admiral. So please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mallory, and good evening, everybody. It's a very rainy day out here in Mumbai. It's pouring cats and dogs, so to say, and it's good to be sitting in a webinar and hearing all of you experts. Let me begin by firstly complimenting and thanking my panelists, Ambassador Y.K. Sinha and Commander Das, for really preparing the ground so well. And their interventions, I think, have prepared all of us for the kind of talk and for the kind of topic that we have laid out for ourselves today. We need to also compliment MRC and Neil Dhwani in particular, as well as Bridge Tank of France for organizing this seminar. I think it is great to see that we have a French think tank now getting involved in the UDA issues, which have been orchestrated by MRC for so many years now. And I'm sure this will be of great benefit to MRC in future. UDA by itself is a concept that we really now need to push at all levels. The importance of this has been very nicely highlighted by the two speakers before me. We've seen that in the last 2 years, the kind of disruptive challenges that pandemic and wars can bring upon us, and to deal with them required an international cooperation and coordinated effort. And I feel that UDA too is a kind of concept that needs complete coordination, collaboration, and cooperation at the international level for it to succeed. But in particular, the topic for today is how useful is AUKUS for all of this? And I will touch upon all these issues in the next 20-25 minutes. All the speakers before me have already highlighted, particularly Commander Arnab Das has highlighted the technical aspects of underwater domain awareness, and he's been at this for many, many years now. But in my talk today, what I'm going to tell you about, perhaps some of you are aware, is firstly, what is the historical narrative of UDA after World War II, and why UDA is necessary from the strategic perspective, why China's maritime ambitions are causing concern, what is the role of Quad and AUKUS in dealing with these concerns, and how can India be a useful partner in cooperative efforts for developing international UDA. But let me begin by taking you back to the World War II or the post-World War II era, which was defined by superpower competition, and which really gave the impetus for developing and deploying the UDA. As we all know that in the post-World War II era, and in the Cold War particularly, which lasted till about the mid-90s, the issue of grave concern to world security was nuclear war. How to prepare for nuclear war, and more importantly, how to avoid it, was a matter of overarching importance to the superpowers and the power blocks or alliances that emerged. And effective deterrence, nuclear deterrence, was the key to preventing annihilation in a nuclear holocaust. And all variety of weapons and launch platforms were developed and deployed by the two power blocks, and supported by equally diverse nuclear doctrines. And one superpower could annul the nuclear capability of the other in a nuclear exchange, except if that capability was deployed at sea on a submarine. And therefore, the submarine was considered the most survivable platform in this kind of a situation. And in any international crisis, we've known that the US president would always turn to his commanders and ask, where are my submarines? Because the nuclear propelled submarine, which SLBM capability, became the true goalkeepers of nuclear stability, but only so far as they remained unseen and undetected in the Atlantic, Pacific, or even the Indian Ocean. And therefore, this gave the impetus for developing the UDA, leading to intense research and urgency. And the bloc that had better UDA had a better chance of surviving in a nuclear exchange. The NATO, of course, took the lead in deploying the first undersea network of seabed sensors, what we call the SOSUS, and it was deployed in the GIUK gap, as has already been highlighted. And this gap was chosen particularly because any SSN or SSBN of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Navy, had to transit through this gap to get into the Atlantic. Once in the Atlantic, it would get lost in the vast expanse, and then it would, of course, be very difficult. But to supplement the SOSUS, which is a seabed surveillance system, the NATO navies deployed aircraft and ship as well, and it was a coordinated effort of all the three components that finally gave the UDA the very successful architecture. But it required enormous resources, Herculean multidisciplinary research effort, constant 24/7 surveillance over vast ocean stretches, and worldwide deployment by Western navies if they had to succeed in locating and tracking nuclear submarines. And all this was possible because of the collaborative effort of the countries in the Western Alliance. But the results paid off. Real nuclear deterrence was achieved, and as we all know, catastrophe was averted. But with the end of the Cold War, after collapse of the Soviet Union, most of the Soviet SSBN fleet was decommissioned, and consequently, the importance of UDA and all this UDA architecture diminished over time, mainly because it was too expensive and therefore unsustainable for long. Now, with limited Russian SSBNs, the reasoning for maintaining a robust UDA had almost vanished. But what changed subsequently was the expansion and rise of the PLA Navy, especially its strategic submarine fleet. And this has now rekindled interest in UDA. More importantly, as has already been mentioned, the great underwater wall, China has also developed its own UDA, a system of underwater sensors, and it has been deployed for quite a few years now. And the war in Ukraine has only added to the kind of urgency because uncertainty created in the geopolitical situation. We will now see that there will be new alignments that will reshape the maritime security outlook. And as we all know, oceans are accepted global commons for free and unconditional use, but this will certainly face challenges as we go ahead. We know that China will continue its assertiveness and move towards aggressiveness. We've seen that in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, of course, in the Taiwan Straits, and across India's northern borders as well. And although there has been some amount of pushback by the concerned countries, but that is not going to be enough, according to me. And it will require concerted effort of a concert of countries. And I think in this regard, I would like to mention the importance of Quad and AUKUS, and I will touch upon this and talk about it just in a while. Now, when we look at the strides made by China in expanding its maritime influence in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, we see that while assertiveness of China and the South China Sea is well known, its creeping influence in the India's neighborhood in the Indian Ocean region is equally serious. We need to understand that managing this area of Chinese influence requires us to expend resources and deny China that space. As Ambassador Vaikesson already rightly mentioned, the Honorable Prime Minister had announced the initiative of Sagar in 2015 in Mauritius, and subsequently several projects have been undertaken by various Indian agencies, especially the maritime agencies. But there is still a lot of scope to do even more under Sagar program, and so that we can put a check, or at least create some kind of a barrier to China's expanding influence. And let me explain why this is required. We've seen that since 2008, and 2008 is not very many years ago. Since 2008, the PLA Navy has deployed its assets continuously in the Indian Ocean region, and it has now become a permanent. We have their warships, not only warships, we have scientific research ships, missile tracking ships, satellite monitoring ships, intelligence ships, fishing militia, and all of them are present in the Indian Ocean all the while. Djibouti in Africa has become China's first overseas military base. But a bigger concern is the presence of the Chinese nuclear attack submarines, which are now present for nearly half the year continuously in the Indian Ocean region. And they are free to call on ports in Karachi, in Colombo, and even in Gwadar. Even a submarine support ship accompanies these submarines while they are on deployment. Although SSBNs have not yet been deployed by the PLA Navy in the Indian Ocean region, but the day is not very far when that will also happen. Nuclear submarines, of course, have a considerable advantage over the conventional submarines. They can stay much longer underwater, perhaps for several weeks. And of course, the transit speed and patrol speed is much, much higher. Overall, they have a very strategic impact once deployed for coercive purposes. And in that regard, we know that China has currently 6 Jin-class SSBNs, and with its JL-2 ballistic missiles, it has a range of nearly 4,600 nautical miles. Eventually, a total of 8 are planned. But not only submarines, as has been pointed out by Arnav, we also have UUVs, and these UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles, can be used for all variety of tasks, such as surveillance, intelligence, mapping seabed, monitoring ocean parameters, search for objects, sonar surveillance, search and rescue, and so many other tasks. And these can be launched many hundreds of kilometers away from the coast in international waters, and they can be detrimental to security of the coastal state. We also know, as pointed out, that China has already developed its own UDA, and it's called Underwater Great Wall. It's been in operation since 2015 in the South China Sea. And we have indication that this kind of technology, or this kind of UDA architecture, is also deployed off the US naval bases in the Pacific, some of them. Now, coming to speakers before me have talked of maritime domain awareness, and maritime security experts will testify that it requires well-developed MDA structure to be able to track, locate, monitor ships in the ocean. This is the first and most important requirement for maritime security. Without this, maritime security is a non-starter. But due to relentless efforts, we in India have now put in place a very robust MDA architecture. I know for sure because I was very deeply involved when I was in service. Today, we are in a position to know the exact coordinates and other details of all ships and craft, perhaps nearly 10,000 of them, who are transiting in the Indian Ocean region on a 24/7 basis. And all this has been achieved after many years of patient pursuit of developing cutting-edge technologies, organizational restructuring, effective training, interagency cooperation, and so forth. It was not an easy task. In addition to intergovernmental cooperation for exchange of white shipping information has also been important to give a major boost to our MDA. And today, I think all of us in India and Indian Navy are very proud that we have a functional international fusion center, which has representative naval officers of more than 15 navies. And this is located at Gurgaon near New Delhi. And this has become one of the most admired MDA centers in Asia. And this has definitely strengthened our regional maritime security manifold. And this is just a telling example of how collaborative and cooperative effort in information sharing boosts our maritime security. Now, underwater domain awareness is nothing but the below water component of MDA. And this is also necessary to develop this to address the strategic challenge of maritime security. Like the MDA architecture, the UDA also requires massive investments in underwater technologies as well as international coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. The net result will be a better awareness of submarine and UUV deployments in the Indo-Pacific. Information exchange, sharing of technical expertise, sharing experience sharing, resources sharing, etc. between countries will definitely be required if we have to have an effective UDA. But UDA is not only about maritime security, it has scientific, economic, and political benefits as well. And a meaningful UDA in the Indo-Pacific region will require a considerable effort between the countries involved. In the Indo-Pacific, the areas of maritime interest which require UDA will of course be very limited. And in this regard, one must really appreciate that the two initiatives of Quad and AUKUS can definitely help in improving not only MDA but UDA. And I will just talk about that for a few minutes. But which one of the two has the potential to achieve UDA in the Indo-Pacific region for strategic and maritime security is the moot question. Actually, we need to ask if either AUKUS or Quad is even structured for accomplishing such a massive, complex, challenging, resource-intensive, collaborative, and cooperative effort for realizing UDA. So let me just examine in brief both Quad and AUKUS. Quad, as the speakers before me have already highlighted, is a strategic dialogue between the four countries, the US, India, Australia, and Japan, which started in 2007 due to the initiative of the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Shinzo Abe, along with the US President, Australian Prime Minister, and the Indian Prime Minister. The Quad is an association of democratic powers to offer an alternative to the China-led initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad is visualized as not only a construct for dialogue on security in the region, but Quad has also stated and reiterated during the first in-person Leaders Summit on 24th September last year that it aims to develop collaboration across various non-security sectors as well. And dialogue is not restricted only to the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. It is now extended, as Ambassador Sinha already pointed out, to cooperation in many other areas such as climate change, infrastructure projects, connectivity, vaccine, critical technology, cyber security, resilient supply chains, and so forth. And the Quad actually was born out of it started after as a response, HADR response effort after the tsunami of 2004, but today it has expanded its wings. And there are two underlying motivations behind this grouping and vision. The first was that the United States, Australia, India, and Japan have a vested interest in upholding rules and norms of the current order, augmenting existing institutions, ensuring freedom of navigation and trade, and promoting connectivity, economic development, and security within existing rules and standards. And the second was that all members believed that China's rise and reach of its Belt and Road Initiative posed a challenge to the region. And basically, Quad was dominant for the first 10 years, but in 2017, it was resurrected resurrected for a number of reasons, not the least was that the US administration now pivoted to the Indo-Pacific region. But Quad has been scorned by the Chinese leadership, who have dismissed it as similar to the foam of a huge sea wave that simply dissipates on being formed. They have also branded Quad as an Asian NATO, which of course it is not. And against the backdrop of Quad, AUKUS was suddenly formed last year, and the trilateral partnership is a strategic alliance which has, as a first step, announced the sharing of nuclear submarine technology between the USA and Australia. This is, as we know, a tripact of the Anglophone countries who are also members of the Five Eye Intelligence Compact. Quite clearly, AUKUS has a definite military and security aim. AUKUS has been dubbed as the most significant security arrangement between the three nations since World War II. Quad, on the other hand, is far from any military pact. Instead, it is a robust partnership of nations, four nations that emphasize non-military or security matters, especially the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific spaces. The AUKUS made sense for UK, Australia, and the US, but not for France. India and Japan could never be part of AUKUS, firstly, given India's aversion to military security pacts and its strong sense of strategic autonomy. And secondly, Japan's own aversion to nuclear technology. Also, Canada and New Zealand, the other two members of Five Eyes intelligence community, have long adopted a meeker stance as compared to USA and Australia. This explains the alacrity with which the new grouping was formed. AUKUS helps India without directly involving India, since the trilateral pact includes close strategic partners of Delhi who seek to counter China in this region. And consequently, this serves New Delhi's interests for a stable balance of power. Thus, we see Quad is not a security alliance, while AUKUS most definitely is. If that be so, how can we find common ground for developing UDA for strategic and security requirements in order to face the challenge of China? The answer to this poser is not immediately clear. Nonetheless, the AUKUS can play a significant role in developing UDA through encouraging institutional linkages, experience sharing, information exchange, and so on between all the Quad partners. After all, and this is important, it has been agreed during the Quad summit in May 2022 in Tokyo that MDA will also be an area of cooperation between the four members through the Indo-Pacific Partnership for MDA. The partnership is expected to transform the ability of countries in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Indian Ocean region to fully monitor the seas and oceans around them. And India is already well placed to contribute towards this initiative through the well-established Information Fusion Center, which I just talked about, which is in Delhi. And this can easily be networked through other such centers which are functional in Singapore, the Solomon Islands, and a couple of other places. Considering that UDA is nothing but a subcomponent of MDA, it is not before long that we can expect to see cooperation for UDA also on similar lines through dialogue between Quad and AUKUS institutions. In summary, we can expect to see major realignments in groupings post the COVID era and the post the Ukraine war. And because of China's aggressive and assertiveness, these kind of alignments will fall into place much faster. We've seen that the PLA Navy is already moving into the Indian Ocean and established permanent bases. We know that MDA is now well developed, and but UDA still remains underdeveloped, and more work is required. Quad and AUKUS countries can work together towards developing a common UDA framework for the Indo-Pacific. After all, if cooperation in MDA has already been agreed upon by Quad, can UDA be far behind? And I think because of the current security situation, we have no option but to move towards establishing a common UDA under the aegis of Quad and AUKUS. I think I've finished in the given time. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Cave. Thank you for your presentation highlighting the strategic aspect of the region since the Second World War. So thank you. You have highlighted the need to ensure stability in the region, particularly faced to the expansion of the Chinese maritime influence, and also the expansion of the Chinese submarines. You also emphasizes that several initiatives and tools exist to ensure this stability, but that more needs to be done, notably concerning the UDA. And you finished by presenting the AUKUS and the Quad that can contribute to maritime stability and promote the UDA. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now let's welcome the next panelist to give an overview and share his experience on regional security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Vishal Thapar, who is the group editorialist head Defense, Security and Policy at Business World. He was formerly associated with Hindustan Times and prominent news channels CNN, IBN, and NewsX, and is founder, editor of armingindia.com, India's first portal on the business and politics of India defense trade. So, Mr. Thapar, you have the floor. I think your microphone is off.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you to the panelists before me. Thanks to Ambassador Sinha. And between Admiral Karve and Commander Das, they've covered the UDA element extremely well. Now, I'll start off with the visit of the French Defense Minister Florence Parly to Delhi in December last year. There was some chatter during that visit about the Barracuda and about the about the technologies for the development of nuclear-powered submarines being put on the table, although there was no mention of it in the official statement. That said, this represents a key gap in Indian capability, and India, as has been pointed out, it could be in a happier position. It is lacking in UDA, the technology base is low, the numbers are low, and we need to collaborate. 70% of India's submarines are 40 years old. There is no SSN or a nuclear-powered submarine at the moment in the Indian Naval Fleet. Our conventional submarine building program is at least 20 years behind schedule, and our conventional submarine fleet, which I mentioned, 70% of it is 4 decades old, is meant essentially for littoral operations. Now, it is also known that for strategic deterrence, for continuous CASD or deterrence sailing, for one SSBN to be out at sea at all times, 4 submarines are required. So we are nowhere near this figure or this requirement at the moment. And as far as the larger UDA is concerned, which both Admiral Karve and Commander Das explained very well, there is a need for collaboration and cooperation amongst like-minded countries, as are represented by both the Quad and the AUKUS, which is the focus and the theme of this webinar. US and Japan most definitely are leaders in underwater acoustics. The earlier panelists referred to the need for passive and active sensors, particularly in the choke points. There is also a need to try and map the waters. India has a deep ocean mission. This is essentially a civilian mission, but the technology involved is dual purpose, and there is substantial output which is expected out of this mission. But yes, there is this need for greater underwater technologies, autonomous vessels, and passive and active sensors. So Now, the motivation for both the Quad and more particularly the AUKUS, which has a sharper focus, well, it is China. And the Chinese aggression in the Himalayas in Ladakh 2 years ago, it has ended up freeing India of a lot of its earlier hesitation in participating or collaborating in securing itself against aggression in the common areas, in the global commons by China. So, but there is always been clarity on the Chinese side vis-a-vis India and the need perhaps for a containment of India to the South Asian region. Now, I recall a scholar from Carnegie, who's an American national based out of China a few years ago. She made a presentation at the IDSA in New Delhi, where she made the point that most of the greater chatter in Chinese, the overwhelming sort of mention or chatter in Chinese strategic response with regard to India is about the Indian Navy and its capability, followed by India's strategic capability. But obviously, the reference was very clearly to the Chinese sense of vulnerability in the Indian Ocean region and the position of advantage which India has shift the contest, say, from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean region. And China, nonetheless, has made very rapid strides in the Indian Ocean region, which create a greater need and necessity for more effective UDA by India and the partner sort of the like-minded countries. It's been mentioned that the Chinese made an advent into the Indian Ocean region in 2008, and perhaps 10 years. That was 10 years earlier than most people would have expected it to, and now it's a permanent fixture. They came in with the purpose of participating in the international anti-piracy patrols. We know that there's been no incident of piracy over the last 3 years, but the Chinese continue to be a permanent fixture. And as the Admiral just pointed out, they have a permanent base out of Djibouti and considerable presence in the region, including those of SSNs. So, so it's an impressive presence and also a demonstration that of prolonged deployment, which they've been able to sustain. Reference has also been made by the earlier speakers about the impressive capability building, about the Chinese wall and the choke points, the anti-access and anti-denial capabilities which have been built up by China, and the carrier killers, the development of those technologies, the DF-21 and 26. So, so very clearly, I mean, India is looking for influence in the waters around it, and China wants to contain that influence. And we also see that 67% of China's arm imports are to countries immediately around India, and these are Pakistan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. So that that leads, and this the entire context. As I said, the military standoff, the ongoing and continuing military standoff in the Himalayas leaves India with very little option, but it's in its enlightened self-interest to collaborate with like-minded partners and perhaps shift the space, the contestation of the battle space, to an area which where perhaps it has an advantage. Now, AUKUS, it is meant to contain China, and if it keeps China pinned down in the Pacific, this is something which benefits India. So Now, we're also seeing that while there's a very sharp strategic contestation in the Indian Ocean region, there is also a likelihood that in the decades to come, some of that contest may shift to the to the north as the Arctic route opens for shipping, and that is something which may also be used for military for military purposes. So so that's yes, that's. I think I'm ready to toss this back to the other panelists. So, but there's, as I said, that there's need for cooperation and collaboration on development of UDA and including the submarines and other measures for for military denial and military control. So. Both sensors and choke points, both passive and active sensors. And India clearly has some distance to go, although some impressive beginnings have been made to this MDA architecture, which the Admiral just referred to. So thank you very much. I'm going to toss this back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thapa. Thank you for sharing your analysis of the international agenda, of the solutions to be put forward, in particular in terms of technology, but also of the Chinese context in the region. Thank you very much. So now, last but not least, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Joël Ruet, my dear colleague. So Joël Ruet is a civil engineer of the École des Mines, doctor in industrial economics and former fellow at the London School of Economics. And he's now an economist at the CNRS and École Polytechnique. He's also the founder and chairman of the Bridge Tank, specialist on emerging economy, in particular in Asia, India, and West Africa. So Joël, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Is my sound clear to everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be for us at the Bridge Tank to be associated with this webinar, chiefly and mostly orchestrated by our friend Arnab Das. We must say we learn a lot, and over the time, as Mallory said, we get a clearer and clearer understanding on a topic which is particularly tricky. And I'll get back to this later, but this will be orient the feed of my few words on how to kind of refine and define what we're talking about and the mode of action. And I appreciate what previous speakers, Mr. Tsina, Mr. Carve, namely, mentioned about, what is the right tool at the end and what's the right perimeter of action, both internationally, regionally, bilaterally sometimes, or nationally. That's the tricky things. The what do we do is very much conditioned to what's the understanding of the situation. Karl Marx used to say that battles are always won through ideas, and I think exchanging and browsing ideas on this topic has never been as timely as it is today, and I really thank Arnab Das for this great series of events. One first word I want to say in this line is, in order to excuse Ambassador Wisner and Ambassador de Gallet, Ambassador Wisner from the US and Ambassador de Gallet from France. I can't speak in their name, I can even less replace them, but the idea, and they have last minute commitments, which are very important. But the idea we had in convening them was for us to help get the picture, because when I talk about this refining of the picture, we need to set the original picture. Ambassador de Gallet was the diplomatic advisor at the French Prime Ministerial Office, and we had discussed with him that his view on the fact that, in a sense, all those underwater awareness, underwater activities had always been there, would put a word of caution on what we discussed today. And this very seminar proves us at the Bridge Tank wrong. This idea that we have of testifying that, well, it's new clothes, but on all topics, is most possibly wrong. And we need maybe to have very fresh ideas, because the technology has changed, because the understanding that technology needs to be refined in tropical waters, that within tropical waters there are sub-technologies, that technologies link up with an whole ecosystem, and that those issues appear at a time when, at the same time, the life of ocean is endangered, and the security of oceans and of countries is at threat by some powers. So this intrication, most likely with a complexification of technology and the possible loophole on maritime populations and fish and shrimps and whatnot, is quite unique in our lifetime. So we all know that when we talk those issues, we talk, well, dual aspects. It's civilian, it's military at the same time. What is the right format? Here we have a format, and definitely the issue has changed a lot. The idea of inviting Frank Wisner, who had been the Undersecretary of the US beyond being ambassadors, was that I recalled a conversation I had with him not so long ago. It must have been in 2018. And in a nutshell, not to disclose too much because it was a private conversation, but the idea was that on very strategic issues in the Indo-Pacific, not necessarily South Asia, but Southeast Asia, we were discussing, that the military doctrine at the Pentagon is very clear, super clear, and that in terms of defense, not much of thinking would be needed in terms of crisis, and that the qualification of reaction in terms of immediate threats was very clear. And it would have been, of course, good to hear him now, and again, he's 100% excused with other commitments that came to him urgently to serve his country. So we can't infer on what he would have said, but we understand there is a feeling that those issues having become more intricate, more complex, first of all, the time of reaction on some security threats might differ today, as given past a certain level of threat, we can't have time in a reaction. We still have to pre-decide, and then pre-deciding calls for a bulk of information, a bulk of data, a bulk of heterogeneous data, mingling with different systems, ecosystems, and different time frames, and also unknown ripple effects as those seas are now, being cruised by a numerous number of submarines and whatnot. Well, that the amount of pre-crisis thinking has become mind-boggling. So that's what I understand, and I thank this workshop and the contributors before me to having said that. To having laid this understanding for the laypersons we are in terms of defense. Now, having said this, I don't want to just stick here because what I've said would just be noise on a signal. The signal by the previous speakers was very clear, and I don't want that my comment is just noise on that. So I would, instead of having elements, I would raise questions, and I would put towards you, ladies and gentlemen, some questions on how to progress on this complexity. We know that, and you've some of you have been very kind enough to appreciate that a French so-called think tank is associated to your thinking. Well, we're based in France. We don't represent France. We're independent, as we said. We also have board members from many countries, huge majority of them coming from democratic countries, and majority of them out of these coming from the global south. And I think this kind of collective exercise is very important, and I would put not answers or messages, but questions. First of all, I think we ought to consider what is the right format of having, technicians, think tankers, and policymakers in our conversations. The second question would be about civilians and army persons. What's the right fit and what's the right format as well? On this, I believe that we're out of the weird period of COVID pandemics and etc. I really call for a closed door, presential, as we say, conversation at some point in time. And my last series of comments would be on what we call track 2 diplomacy. No doubt our countries are already discussing. Previous speakers have mentioned about the AUKUS, about the Quad. Well, those formats are evolutive in contents and in geography, in perimeter. France is not in AUKUS now. The AUKUS started in a peculiar manner for the French marine industry, but things got settled, and there was, there wasn't a fire without a spark. So things are getting better. So no one says that France or other countries will never be in AUKUS in the future, that Quad can't evolve and all that. So the perimeter can evolve, the missions can evolve. I know that the Quad being not being an Asian form of NATO is quite substantiated with the very recent demands or suggestions by, for instance, Japan or South Korea for the NATO to consider an extension to the Asia-Pacific regions. This is a formal demand by the current governments of those two countries, which proves that the Quad AUKUS can't serve as a basis. This demand has been made to NATO itself and not to the Quad or the AUKUS. So I think we can, as observers, as analysts, observe what in the diplomatic circles is happening at the bilateral, multilateral, regional organizations or regional organization possibly spreading beyond organizations. But today, none of us speaks in an official capacity. And I really believe that as there's always space for track 2 diplomacy, informed by ideas. On this matter, track 2 diplomacy is very important. Track 2 diplomacy is, by definition, independent thinking, independent linkages across people, organizations representing only themselves and not their states, not their governments, across borders, across frontiers, but with a kind of recognition by their all national administrations that this exercise is well understood by the administration, that it's worthwhile. So this very peculiar position between being autonomous and being kind of understood by one's country's organizations is very important. And here again, I can only vouch support and be very appreciative of the work of the MRC. There are many think tanks working on any sort of topic. What we observe on the MRC is that the MRC has the intellectual autonomy while having, we believe, the trust and the confidence by the government of India, and this is and the authorities and also the military authorities of the country. It is very important. So in our own very humble capacity of an autonomous think tank based in France, we can express support that whatever we can bring to the attention of, for instance, the French authorities on the very importance of the conversations we're having today. Whatever we can do, we will do. I will move to, again, on this track 2 diplomacy, so something which is somewhat closer to our zone of comfort, which is the technology. the technology is one key component to innovation once we've understood that the political and diplomatic frame is set. So having kind of said that through a question, through trying to know what's the right approach, and how maybe these talks could be not institutionalized because they need to keep their autonomy, but being more and more followed by the policymakers of our countries. Having said that, I'm back to technology. I think we ought to have an independent research program on how technologies need to be, I don't like the word indigenized, but as Arnab Das mentioned, technologies cannot just be transferred, cannot just be simply applied. And I think, and I was appreciative that Arnab Das mentioned that there could be a scope for India on cooperation with France. I think we have to be on the French side pretty aware that this is an opportunity for France. This is an opportunity for French technology companies to learn as well, because our technologies, the technologies of our companies, will need to evolve, will need to adapt, will need to gain new markets, will need to get new functionalities by being more adapted, more fine-tuned to environments which are not the environments in which the technologies got developed. The technologies are not universal. Technologies have to fit to an environment. This is something we in the defense industry in France start to understand when over the last few years France has used its technologies developed for different battlefields, when it has used that in the Sahelian region in sub-Saharan Africa. This is something even when we think about our science, when the models for understanding the ecosystems, the climate change, climate resilience, the ways to absorb carbon by different ecosystems, we have to fine-tune the equations. A forest in Europe, a forest, an equatorial forest, or various kind of dry ecosystems in sub-Saharan Africa are not the same in terms of contributing a global good, which is fighting climate change. So this is the same for waters. We'll have, as French dispositive, to increasingly navigate. And I'll stop there, but just by mentioning that, as Commodore Das was mentioning, France does have a very large imprint on the Pacific. As we see, well, there are the territorial waters, but one cannot just claim that territorial waters are safe if you don't navigate what's slightly beyond the territorial waters. And as we understand that more and more powers navigate those extraterritorial waters, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and that they navigate it with a fast-growing numbers of submarines, of devices, but also with a growing number of research centers and monitoring centers. The magnitude of investment in terms of public finance is tremendous. And this public finance ought to be very well placed with the fine-tuned technologies. Fine-tuning the technology, again, is, in a nutshell, the submarines which have been developed for the North Atlantic, fine-tuned, not fine-tuned, but kind of twisted to fit any kind of ocean, now how to be fine-tuned. And maybe in the future, we need to have a special Navy force for France, which will be deployed mostly to the Atlantic and the Pacific, sorry, and the South Indian and the Indian Ocean, South Asian Ocean, sorry. And this colossal investment ought not to be made in isolation. These are some very open questions which you can see, but to conclude, I'm very struck by some disruption. Just a few years ago, speaking with, as we're talking about China, about Chinese military capacities, hardly a few years ago, I recall a conversation in Paris with an ambassador from a very wealthy country in Asia. Let you imagine which one. And the ambassador told us, well, the Chinese have an army which know how to earn money. They still need to have an army which can win a war. We still have many people convinced that People's Liberation Army is limited in many circumstances, that the last real war they fought was in 1979 in Vietnam, and this was a blatant defeat for China. But we understand that river has flown under the bridges since that time. We understand that over the last few years, large amount of money has been invested, and we can't know what would be the result on the field of operation. And that just over the last few years, and the figures that were told by the experts before me are telling. So we navigate into troubled waters. We navigate into a sea which is changing, and we navigate into a geostrategic system which has never been so dark. You know, our collective sonar is blurred. We have different noises that come and blur the signals, and I think it's high time to think. And my very last point is that very often and that's why I believe in track 2 diplomacy, because track 2 diplomacy is not the preserve of diplomats. We love diplomats. We have many diplomats as our board members. We miss 2 diplomats today. Again, I feel sorry that they can't join us, but somehow those large AUKUS, Quad, NATO, and whatnot systems tend to overlook the details, tend to loom at too large ideas not pegged into the reality. I love that slide which mentioned about the ground realities, you know, for the submarines. And I think that this conversation between people who have a bit of technicity, I don't want to say experts, technicians, but a bit of technicity from civilian, from dual world, from civilian and military, from different perspectives and time frames, should generate ideas and should be useful for diplomats. So I'm calling everyone to think collectively about a way to anchor what we do into diplomacy while keeping this very important methodological distance from diplomats. And I apologize, as very great diplomats have been with us today on the Indian side, but it's with due respect. I hand over the floor here with my apologies for having been more exploratory than conclusive. But I think we have a lot of food for thought in those webinars, and it's possibly important to take time and pause and reflect on them and munch for them. And the more seminars we can have, the more the thinking will progress.
Thank you very much, Joel. So since you have raised a series of questions, it's a good time to move forward to our Q&A session. But before we begin to our Q&A session, do our panelists want to speak again or give a last word or even comment what have been said? So please feel free to talk now.
Good evening, everyone. This is Shubham Singh Charak. I am a PhD research scholar in the Department of National Security Studies, Central University of Jammu. Since the last few years, the Indo-Pacific is in the limelight, and everyone is talking about the Indo-Pacific region. And I want to know that what impact can AUKUS can made on the region of Western Indian Ocean, and how this can have the impact upon the India's maritime diplomacy, especially for the region of Western Indian Ocean. And currently, I have started working on the India's maritime diplomacy in the Western Indian Ocean region, and this will help me. So, if you can answer this, please. Thank you.
Request Admiral Karve sir to give his comments, and then Ambassador YK Sinha sir.
Right. So I think the question is from Shubham Singh Charak, who's pursuing his security studies from University of Delhi, and it pertains to AUKUS, its relevance to security in the maritime security in the Western Indian or Indian Ocean region. A very relevant question, and unfortunately, no easy answer. For the simple reason that firstly, AUKUS is a grouping of 3 countries who what has been put out in the public domain is this grouping is essentially to share nuclear submarine technology with Australia. That is what is known, and that is what is put out in the public domain. Obviously, that cannot be the only aim of AUKUS. It may also have other aims, but for a start, I think it does send out a strong signal that today there is a need for developing counters to the Chinese rise, especially their deployments and developments in the underwater domain. And we've seen that. We've seen that submarines, this nuclear submarines particularly, firstly, their capability is improving, all-round capability, and their numbers too are increasing. And the more worrying factor is the SSBNs. And once you have an SSBN in any part of the ocean, it becomes a huge challenge to locate it because it remains underwater. One of the counters to any SSBN or SSN for that matter is another SSN or an SSBN, rather another SSN, because it becomes a hunter and the hunted kind of game underwater. And to track submarines underwater, you do need to have much quieter nuclear submarines yourself. Because if your own submarine is making so much noise, you are not going to be able to locate another submarine which is supposed to be equally quiet. This is complemented by other sources kind of devices. So it's just locating and tracking submarines is requires humongous effort, requires coordination, requires resources, unimaginable resources. You have to put aircraft, ships, submarines, underwater sensors all together. You have to share intelligence. You have to share information to locate, detect, track just one submarine. So to answer your question, therefore, how relevant AUKUS is relevant because if they are able to develop this kind of submarine technology, they're able to provide technologies to Australia to develop nuclear submarines. It will overall help the underwater domain awareness in the entire region. And that is my short answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Vaikisena, sir, you may like to. The question was basically what would be the impact of AUKUS in the Western Indian Ocean, or probably I would request if you could talk on the entire Indian Ocean region, diplomatic impact.
That's thank you, Commander Das. I think that's a bit of I would call it an unfair task that you've given me, but certainly a challenging one because as far as the AUKUS is concerned, as you know, India is not a part of AUKUS, and India has not really made. I mean, there have been a few statements on it, but we've been taking a very cautious approach on that. And as far as the impact, diplomatic impact, uh, the countries who are members of the AUKUS, we have a very robust bilateral partnership with them. Two of them are our partners in Quad. So I think as far as the exchange of information, ideas, etc., that is an ongoing process. So we have seen this development. This development happened last year. It was announced last year. Obviously, we are not a party to it. Of course, we are aware of what has happened. But beyond that, I think it would be remiss on my part, especially since I can't speak on behalf of the government. All I can say is that this matter is very much, is with the IAEA. And if I recall correctly, on the 6th of June this year, a few weeks ago, the DGIA had referred to the AUKUS in his introductory remarks or statement to the Board of Governors. And I would sort of invite your attention to that. It gives the sort of the contours of what is happening as far as the international community is concerned, as far as multilateral diplomacy is concerned, because the IAEA is seized of the matter. Beyond that, I don't think I can perhaps refer to the Foreign Secretary, the former Foreign Secretary special media briefing in September, because, and it clearly says that AUKUS is a security alliance between three countries. We are not party to this alliance. There, he'd also referred to the Australians clarifying that they are working on a nuclear-propelled submarine. I think Admiral Carvey referred to the details. I'm not going to go into those details. Now, how it impacts the Indian or Western Indian construct, again, that the UK, if I recall correctly, has come up with, I'm not really in a position to comment on. I think as far as the Quad is concerned, we are involved. We are happy to see that there has been progress in diverse areas as far as the Quad is concerned. But again, I would like to go back to what I had said in my original intervention, was that I think it is in our common interest to work towards a peaceful Indo-Pacific, and where we can keep the sea lines of communication open for trade and commerce and tourism and so on. So I think anything that sort of helps achieve that is something that country would consider outside too, because it's such a vast region that there are a very large number of countries, both within the region and outside, who are impacted by developments in this region. But beyond that, I am not prominent because, as I said, I am not in that diplomatic field. One of the speakers referred to diplomats. I could only get a passing reference, so I can only classify myself as a former diplomat. But I think I'm happy to be one. But beyond that, I don't think I'm going to say anything more on AUKUS.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. I think Shubham, you got the answers, but you've also got some indications where you should be looking for the information.
If I may add something, a couple of things, Anam.
Sure, please.
Well, you know, I'm not a diplomat. I'm neither a former diplomat, and I don't represent France. But I believe that I can do what I will say does some justice in conveying a generic feeling that security circles in France have with their US ally. Okay. The USA are an ally of France. There's no doubt. This is a kind of ally who varies from time to time. Fair enough, they're a democracy, they can change governments and etc. They can also vary within the term of a president, because we understand that the domestic situation varies. So we find this kind of, time frame and time horizon of democracies short term, and whereas here we're discussing strategic issues. There's the USA, just like Europe or France, are also industrial powers. So when we think in terms of AUKUS more particularly, we're talking of submarines, we're talking of contracts, we're talking beyond contracts about a whole industry. So there can be competition, and those liberal democracies believe that one part of liberalism is competition. Competition is fair, good enough. But the end result is that for the strategic circles, over time, and not just on this matter, or the same goes with Syria, with other places, increasingly the US, the American ally, has been perceived to be, if not unreliable, at least unstable. So that is one, and this is the way AUKUS has been perceived, with, as I was saying, a bit of calming down recently. An economic settlement happened for 5 or 6 billion euro, as far as I remember. But the trust on reliability on strategic issue is still hit. The second aspect, being back to technologies, and I'm a technologist by training. I've been myself trained in nuclear engineering, in civil nuclear engineering. Once you understand that AUKUS is a program to equip a large nation with nuclear technologies on submarines and the whole nuclear industry in itself, maybe, well, you understand that you're talking decades, that you're talking dozens of billions of euro, if not more. And generally speaking, that connects to what I was saying before. Given the environment, given the race, given the rivalry, and getting back to the words of former Ambassador Sina, we want to have those seas open to trade and etc. There's only one way, which is a higher deterrence than the deterrence of those who could have an interest in jeopardizing that. That means a never-ending race, out of which we can expect only huge investment, and those investments ought to be treated at least as a club good, if not as a public good, if no one acts as being excluded from that. So I believe that competition has its limits on those matters. And I fear that the short-term vision of some of our politicians doesn't, I'm not very diplomatically correct in saying that, but that some actions of our politicians are short-sighted. A contract of a few billion euros is not, even of dozens of euros, of billion euros of dollars, is nothing compared to the kind of collective investment we'll need to have to secure those trading routes, first of all, as a collective good. And if some players are not willing to play it collective as a private good, as a club good, sorry. And it's nothing compared to the kind of investment we'll have to put in the livability for ecosystems, for natural ecosystems in our oceans, and the amount of economic development that the blue ocean, the blue economy, brings. So, I think here strategists have to help policymakers to be less myopic and to be more forward-looking.
Thank you, Joel. I think Ambassador YK Sinha sir would have to leave. So your final comments on the webinar, and then we'll go around with the other panelists and even some of the audience.
Thank you, Commander Das. And I think I'd like to compliment the Maritime Research Center, your partners, international partners, and Indian partners who sort of organized this webinar on a subject which is of some import for the region and globally, I would think. I think we've heard different views. I've learned a lot from some of the technical aspects that you brought out, and Admiral Carvey and others panelists on submarine technology, on underground maritime domain awareness. I think these are very useful for people like us who study the issue in general terms, who have views on issues, diplomatic issues, international issues, etc. But I think one tends to learn about certain issues in greater detail in such webinars. And I'm sure all the other panelists too will share my view and appreciation for the organizers for holding this webinar, and also for all those who have participated, who have listened patiently to the various interventions. I do hope you go back better informed than you were before the webinar, and I'd like to encourage the Maritime Research Center, as well as the other organizations involved in organizing this webinar, to continue to do so, to continue to organize webinars and seminars and conferences and reach out to a larger audience, because some of these issues obviously are of great importance to the future of this region and the globe as a whole. But thank you so much for inviting me, and I will take your leave because I do have another commitment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll connect with you post the webinar as well. Thank you very much, sir. I think we'll take some comments from the audience, very quick comments, and then I will request Admiral Karve sir and Mr. Thapar to kindly give their final comments. Anybody from the audience, Admiral Murli sir, or we have AVM Nitin Vaidya sir also, if you would like to give your comments.
Thank you, Arnab. I think it's been a very fascinating discussion of the topic. I really can't add anything more. Admiral Karve has put across the maritime perspective from a mariner's point of view very clearly. But yes, it is a topic, and we got to appreciate the aspects of underwater domain awareness and its importance it plays. And I think, sitting right in the center of Indo-Pacific, where all things are expected to happen in this century, or at least over the next 40, 50 years, as we can see foreseeably, I think India has got a major role. We have taken certain initiatives, at least in expanding knowledge, and as Admiral Karve put it, able to pinpoint happenings in the various places. So I think we need to build on it. Then we will be able to really help everybody around so that we follow a very rule-based order as per international norms, accepted norms in the Indo-Pacific. I'll just stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else from the audience would like to give your comments?
Commander Das, this is...
Yes, sir.
Commander Das, this is Air Vice Marshal retired Vaidya calling.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead, sir. Yes, sir.
It was an extremely informative and educative webinar. I would thank all the panelists for the kind of contribution you did. And the entire summarization by Admiral Muralidharan was absolutely bang on. I foresee a lot of role that India can play into this. And I look forward to some exciting times in the future. And that the MRC continues doing such webinars at frequent intervals and spreading awareness of what we possibly can do in this field. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Admiral Karve, sir, your final words.
Okay, thank you, Arnab. And first of all, let me, as I always do, compliment the tireless effort being put in by MRC, and particularly Commander Dr. Arnab Das in pushing this concept of UDA. I've seen that happening for the last 4 years, and I must say that he has single-handedly brought it up to the level where today we are sitting in a webinar and cooperating, having a cooperative engagement with the think tank in France, the bridge tank of France. I think MRC has reached has taken giant strides in roping in international organizations now. He started, it was a fledgling setup 4 years ago, and I'm so proud to see that we have support from institution, a think tank, a prominent think tank of France, in extending their wholehearted support to his effort. UDA as a concept was completely unknown, completely unfamiliar to those who are not involved, and it goes entirely to his credit that it has reached this stage. And these webinars and seminars are yet another way of spreading the awareness of UDA, and hopefully in some future date we achieve what we've set out to do. It's like climbing Mount Everest. The peak is still very far, but we are getting there one by one. A lot of oxygen is being provided by so many helpers, so many organizations, both within the country and outside. And to that extent, I must really thank the Bridge Tank for being so proactive and collaborating with MRC. MRC really needs more and more oxygen. We have many miles to go or many feet to climb still. Thank you everybody for this excellent webinar. We look forward to many more of these.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Vishal Thapar, quick last word from you.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak again, Commander Das. Thank you to all the panelists for a very enlightening webinar. The underwater dimension is something which has clearly received inadequate attention in India, but the present circumstances and the play of events, the constructs, Quad, and its overlap with AUKUS, they present a unique opportunity to India. There is a huge amount of goodwill for India and an appreciation of its interests, and I think that the time is right to seek collaboration but first of all have clarity about what it wants and then move ahead. Mr. Joel's comments that the transfer of know-how for an SSN would cost dozens of billions of euros is very instructive, and that is indeed a sobering thought. Commander,
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Joel. A quick last word from you, and then we'll shift it to Nishtha.
Yeah, just on one word, not transfer of know-how, but defining a new, developing the know-how and developing the technology. Technology is alive, keeps evolving or dies, So the summarize the essence of today are of no use in few years from now in this increased race and competition. So we urgently need to evolve them. Involving them by just one power, I no longer believe in that. I may be proven wrong. I'm an economist, so economists are often proven wrong. But it seems more reasonable that within a closet of countries which would trust each other in front of a greater threat or greater risk, that those costs are mutualized. And that after that some competition happens on fine tuning here and there, but internet said it differently. The world can afford having dozens of car companies. The world can afford having 2 or 3 or one day 4 aircraft companies. I'm not sure the developed free democratic liberal world can afford to have too many developers of those devices, And it's not just about money, it's about time. The more we share and pool the competencies, the more we learn collectively, the faster we are in this race against threats.
Thank you, Joel. Nishtha, thank you, Mallory. I must thank you for really
it was a pleasure
conducting the webinar very well. Nishtha, all yours.
Thank you so much, sir. A very good evening, everyone. Happy to be back. It's such an honor to be part of this wonderful event. I'm Nishtha and I work at Maritime Research Center as a Communications and Advocacy Fellow. I also look after the UDA Digest e-magazine, which is a platform that allows us to bring together diverse views and thoughts in the form of short articles, videos, commentaries, and creative quotes. So the main objective of this webinar on AUKUS was to help participants get exposed to the policy issues, technological needs, and innovative tools and measures. It is my absolute privilege to propose a vote of thanks and to acknowledge the contribution of those who worked really hard to make this webinar a success. On behalf of Maritime Research Center, which is a technology-driven think tank that is dedicated towards the promotion of underwater domain awareness framework. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed panel. Your thoughts have enlightened our minds, and you've shown us a new path to all the participants here. I would like to thank Ambassador Y.K. Sinha, who's the former High Commissioner to the UK and Sri Lanka, for enlightening us on the topic geopolitical context in the new global order. The Indo-Pacific is a center of global trade and commerce, and therefore a potential area of economic prosperity for the countries in the region. It consists of 38 countries, constituting a large share in the world population and the global GDP, making it a key player in both product and factor markets. The region also dominates 50% of the world's maritime trade. We are grateful to retired Vice Admiral A.R. Karve for providing us with details on strategic security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. Your keynote address has given us great insights on the strategically important Indo-Pacific region, sir. Sincere thanks to Mr. Vishal Thapar, who is the group editorial head on defense and security at Business World, for joining us today and for sharing his thoughts on the regional security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm also very grateful to the Bridge Time team for co-organizing this event with us. Thank you, Mr. Joel and Ms. Mallory, for your kind support. Thank you, Dr. Arnab Das, for apprising our audience on how UDA framework stands relevant for the strategic and security groupings such as AUKUS, BIMSTEC, and Quad. Sincere thanks to the core team at MRC for pulling this off and for handling the event throughout. Thanks to all the participants who have made the event a memorable one. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you, Nishta. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.